On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Washington, I welcome you here this evening to the latest in the Council's Ambassador Series. From time to time during each year, we are pleased to be able to host serving ambassador, both serving ambassadors, United States ambassadors, and ambassadors to the United States for these evening discussions that provide a rare opportunity to hear directly from envoys on the relationship between the countries they represent or are posted to and the United States, as well as an opportunity to better understand the challenges of representing their governments abroad. Tonight we are joined by the Ambassador of Zimbabwe, whose portfolio currently places him in the middle of tense US-Zimbabwe relations. His country, rich in history and culture, and I might add, for those of you who have had Boy Scouts in the family, Scouting was founded there in 1896, is today in many ways in serious trouble, if not facing outright collapse. The once vibrant and diversified economy, once the hope for Africa's future, today is in deep crisis with ominous signs of worse to come. Over the past 5 years, the economy has experienced a precipitous collapse. Manufacturing has shrunk by 50% since 1997. Exports declined by half between 2001 and 2005. And at $760 per person, the annual income has roughly the purchasing power that it did in 1953. Maize production fell 74% from 1999 to 2004. Life expectancy, too, has declined from 60 years to 37 years for men and 34 for women. Perhaps as many as 20% of the population is HIV infected. A quarter of the population has fled the country, and donor countries have withheld hundreds of millions of dollars in aid. Inflation is currently so bad that descriptives become almost meaningless. Prices are now 3 billion-fold greater than 7 years ago. The exchange rate as of early July was 90 million Zimbabwe dollars to the $1 US. To be sure, hyperinflation is now at or beyond the post-war World War I Weimar Republic's level, the worst in history until that time. Barter economy is already taking hold, and all of this is occurring while the world and Zimbabwe await the results of the power-sharing negotiations that have been underway in South Africa between representatives of President Robert Mugabe and Morgan Tsvangirai, the head of the Movement for Democratic Change. Our speaker this evening, His Excellency Machivenyika Mapuranga, Ambassador of the Republic of Zimbabwe to the United States, represents his nation at a critical juncture, but he is well qualified to do so. His scholar, having received a BA and PhD in history from the University of London and a master's degree in history from the University of Edinburgh. He has served as ambassador to Tanzania, to the United Nations, and to Ghana. A skilled diplomat, he has also seen service as special representative of the OAU Secretary General to Rwanda in 1993-94, chairman of the Non-Aligned Movement Political Committee in 1997, special envoy to Somalia, Sierra Leone, and Burundi, and head of the Zimbabwe official delegation to the Commonwealth Summit in Australia in 1999. Tonight he will share with us his analysis of the current situation in his country, as well as on US-Zimbabwe relations, and then take your questions. Please join me in welcoming His Excellency Machivenyika Mapuranga.
Good evening to you all. Madam Heidi Shu, the distinguished officials of the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C., and all the distinguished guests here present. Africa has 53 countries, and yet at times it appears that the attention that is given to my country, Zimbabwe, is out of proportion to the number of countries that are in Africa. And I would like to briefly give you the background to the current situation in Zimbabwe, because perhaps that will serve to answer why there is such a fixation and sometimes say even an obsession with Zimbabwe in the Western media, and particularly amongst the Western governments. Now, Zimbabwe was conquered and colonized in 1890 by the British South Africa Company, whose leader, John Cecil Rhodes, was the eponymous personality for the British colony of Rhodesia. He served as Prime Minister of the Cape province in South Africa, and he averred that his greatest ambition was to paint Africa red from Cape to Cairo, red being the color of the British Empire on the world map. Now, the British South Africa Company, the BSAP, ruled southern Rhodesia until 1922. Southern Rhodesia because, after 1890, Rhodes extended the territory of Her Majesty the Queen Victoria, across the Zambezi River. So there were now two Rhodesias, Northern Rhodesia, which is now called Zambia, and Southern Rhodesia, which is Zimbabwe, and also another territory called Malawi today, and at that time it was called Nyasaland. And until 1922, when there was a referendum which was held by the white settlers there to decide whether to join South Africa as the fifth province of South Africa, or to get what was called responsible government, a form of self-government short of independence. Now, a lot of the recent history of the country has its roots in the colonial policy that shaped the past of this country, Zimbabwe. The colonial experience of Zimbabwe, and I may also add here South Africa, differs from that of the rest of Africa south of the Sahara, because it was predicated on the premise that these two African countries, i.e. Southern Rhodesia and South Africa, were for permanent white settlement because of their congenial temperature, climate. You never have extreme temperatures there. And also because of their vast mineral resources. They were destined to be dominions within the British Empire, or the British Commonwealth, as it was later called. And this was along with countries like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So each of these five countries, Southern Rhodesia, South Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, was referred to in the documents, the official documents of the Colonial Office, which I understand a lot of the guests here are students. If you get to London, if you're interested in the history of Zimbabwe, proceed to the Public Record Office in Kew Gardens. You'll find that in the Colonial Office documents there, these five countries are referred to as white man's country. That's the phrase that is used by great administrators like Cecil John Rhodes himself and Sir Harry Johnston, Lord Salisbury, Lord Aaron Milner. And Cecil John Rhodes, when he conquered Zimbabwe, he said, "I am in God's own country." Those are his own words. And he declared in his will that he did not wish to be buried in the United Kingdom or in South Africa, where he had been Prime Minister, but in Rhodesia. Now, at a place that he called the World's View, the Matopo Hills near Bulawayo, the second largest city in Zimbabwe. And to this day, his grave is a national monument, which attracts a lot of tourists. Now, the policy of white man's country rested on two pillars. The first one was the implementation of a demographic revolution whereby the white settlers would eventually outnumber the natives. And this happened successfully in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, countries that eventually became dominions within the British Commonwealth. And it was well on its way to success also in South Africa and Southern Rhodesia, because the Dutch East India Company, which was the first real white authority in South Africa, they were saying in the 16th century that for every white man, there were about 19,000 natives. But as you know, as we speak now, as we are speaking now, that ratio is down to 1 to 10. And in Zimbabwe, in 1894, the British South African company, which was ruling the country then, estimated that the ratio between the white settlers and the indigenous folk were 1 to 19,000. But at the height of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which was the peak of white settlement in Zimbabwe, that ratio had been changed, narrowed down to 1 to 13. And the second pillar of that policy was the herding of the native population into, in my country, they were called native reserves. Well, I was born and I grew up in a native reserve myself, and I only went to Harare or Salisbury at the age of 12. Now, at the height of land alienation, natives were left with 20% of the land, while the rest was appropriated for white settlement. So the question of land has been at the heart of the Zimbabwean political experience since the Land Apportionment Act was passed in 1930. And the process of land expropriation continued through subsequent legislation well into the 1960s. Now, the Rhodesian Front Party, which came into power in 1964, did so on a platform of white supremacy. The Prime Minister, Ian Smith, vowed that there would never be democracy on the basis of one man, one vote, or universal adult suffrage in his lifetime, which vow he modified later to say, not in 1,000 years. This was said at a time when the rest of Africa to the north of Zimbabwe was winning its independence under majority rule, beginning with Ghana's independence in 1957. The African population in Zimbabwe was therefore left with no option but to follow the American example and fight an independence war. A liberation war that lasted from 1966 and culminated in the 1979 Lancaster House Conference in London, which was chaired by the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington. It is pertinent to mention here that Western powers who are preaching democracy and freedom today were not on the side of the anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggles in Southern Africa. Now, as for the US government, it defied UN sanctions on the rebel Ian Smith regime in Rhodesia. And as many of you may know, US Ambassador Yost, he joined the United Kingdom colleague, Ambassador Caradon, who later became Lord Caradon, in casting the first, I want you to check this out, the first US veto passed in the Security Council in 1970 was on Rhodesia, to block sanctions on Rhodesia. Now, what transpired at the Lancaster House Constitution, conference? The Lancaster House Conference gave us the Lancaster House Constitution, under which Zimbabwe is governed today. It was a compromise agreement to end a protracted liberation war. It was, in most respects, a Westminster type of constitution, providing for a ceremonial head of state, called a president, and an executive prime minister, an independent judiciary, a justiciable Bill of Rights, multi-party system, free press, and freedom of association. It also provided for two entrenched clauses. The entrenched clauses, these are clauses which could not be amended until after the expiry of 10 years. What were they? One, it provided for 20 seats in Parliament reserved exclusively for the white population. Although the liberation movements were saying, oh, we have been fighting racism, so why do you want to entrench racism in our constitution? They agreed to the British argument that after such a protracted war, it is necessary to enshrine in the constitution a confidence-building measure so that there is no exodus of the white population because they have the economic skills for the development of the country. So that was accepted. And the other one that was accepted also and entrenched in the Constitution was that no legislation could be effected within those 10 years to forcibly acquire and redistribute land on an equitable basis. And for 10 years and thereafter, land acquisition was on the principle or on the basis of willing seller, willing buyer. That was the principle, as is the case now in South Africa and Namibia. The 1980, the first democratic elections in the country were organized and supervised on behalf of the British government by the last governor of the last British governor, Lord Solms. And they were observed by international observers, including the United Nations and the Commonwealth. It was won by Robert Mugabe's party, and he proceeded to be the first democratically elected prime minister in the history of the country. Since then, all general elections, except the one this year, because we had a general election in March this year, have been observed and certified free and fair by the African Union and the regional body known as SADC, the Southern African Development Community, and other international observers. Now, the British government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had promised to fund the land reform program by buying land from the white farmers and distributing it to landless black peasants. A little land was indeed bought during what was known as the inception phase of the program. But when the Labour Party of Tony Blair defeated the Conservative Party of Margaret Thatcher in the general election of 1997, British funding was terminated immediately through a letter from the British Minister of Overseas Development, Mrs. Claire Short. The Land Acquisition Act became the basis for the land reform program, and the Constitution was amended to make the new law constitutional. Now, the slow pace of land reform, the first 10 years, land was untouchable, and then after that, it was on the basis of willing seller, willing buyer. This slow pace of land reform led to incipient revolt when landless peasants, supported by Liberation War veterans, started to occupy white farms, daring the Zimbabwe police to arrest them and the army to shoot them. Well, none of this happened because these two forces, the police and the army, were also substantially made up of Liberation War veterans. To stem the tide of revolt, the government was forced to launch a fast-track land reform program in 2000 in order to hasten the redistribution of land on an equitable basis. This led the British government to instigate the formation, and through the Westminster Foundation, you want to check on that one, westminsterfoundation.com, to fund the creation of an opposition party called the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, with Morgan Tsvangirai as its president and leader. The British and their allies in the European Union imposed sanctions, and so did the US Congress. As far as the US is concerned, their sanctions package consists of two baskets. The first one is a list of Zimbabwe government leaders who are barred from entering the United States, and their assets, personal assets, were frozen. And the second one was an act of Congress called ZDERA, being the acronym for the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which was passed in 2001. Now, it provided for financial sanctions. What it did say, and you may wish to check this out, Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act 2001, that the Secretary of the Treasury would instruct all US citizens who are directors in financial organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF, is the Bretton Woods Institution, any financial institution, wherever it may be, to deny credit to the government of Zimbabwe and to to block any application for rescheduling credits and so forth, and that these financial measures will remain in force until the land ownership situation reverts to what it was in 1998. Now that brings us to the current situation. After the 2000 general election, there was a general election in 2000 in which the newly created opposition party participated. Zimbabwe was still characterized by a multi-party democratic system in which the largest parliamentary opposition party in Africa, the MDC, was in a process of expanding its membership. And in the first elections, the MDC won 57 seats, and the ruling party 63, a mere difference of 6 seats, just a narrow margin, making it the largest parliamentary opposition in Africa. After the 2000 general election, the situation continued to be characterized by a multi-party democratic system, but the opposition party went through a spell of inchoate disintegration over the question of whether or not they should participate in the Senate elections. An amendment to the Constitution copied the American system of having a Senate and a House. And the opposition did not want this kind of arrangement, and they decided to boycott the elections to the Senate. And that created a split within the opposition party. As you know, there are now 2 MDCs today, one led by Morgan Tsvangirai and the other one led by Arthur Mutambara. I want to say here that the split within the MDC was greeted with disappointment, utter disappointment, in London as well as in Washington, because both the UK and the US governments and their allies within the European Union were hoping for what they called regime change that would usher in a government that would reverse the land reform program, which they see as undemocratic and a violation of human rights and property rights, a view that is contested by the ruling party, which sees such an argument as a defense of white privilege. The State Department's 2006 report, which is available and you may wish to consult that, the report on human rights proclaimed that the US government is working closely with the opposition and civil society organizations to have the ZANU-PF government replaced by an MDC government. But the British and the US governments have failed on several occasions in their attempt to have Zimbabwe condemned by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in Geneva. Their draft resolutions submitted on an annual basis have always been defeated as the rest of the world rallied behind the Zimbabwe government. Zimbabwe, on the contrary, was elected and went on to serve as a member of the Human Rights Commission, now known as the Human Rights Council. In the face of fierce opposition by the United Kingdom, the US, and their allies, Zimbabwe was elected last year to chair the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development. And so Zimbabwe has, over the years, enjoyed the solidarity not only of the world as demonstrated in its election to the chairmanship of the UN Commission on Sustainable Development, but above all, that of the region itself, SADC. The SADC summit, which met last year in March 2007, issued a declaration of its, and I quote, solidarity with the government and people of Zimbabwe, and called on the UK, the US, and other allies to remove the financial sanctions against the country. The SADC summit also instructed its executive secretary, the executive secretary of SADC, to undertake a study and come up with proposals on how the SADC can help the economy in Zimbabwe. It also requested President Thabo Mbeki to facilitate talks between the ruling party and the two opposition parties with a view to ensuring that there would be a level political playing field before the next general election, which was held this year. The other regional group to which Zimbabwe belongs, COMESA, is the community of East African, of Eastern and Southern Africa, met in Nairobi also last year and elected President Robert Mugabe as vice president and decided to hold its next summit in Harare. The summit has since been postponed because of the recent electoral process in that country. Now, the African Union defeated attempts by the European Union at the instigation of Brussels to host the next joint summit without President R.G. Mugabe. The last joint AU-EU summit was eventually held, but was boycotted by Prime Minister Gordon Brown, while all the others attended. Meanwhile, President Thabo Mbeki's efforts have been bearing fruit. In September 2007, all parties in the talks agreed on Constitutional Amendment number 18, which had the following provisions. That one, that the presidential, parliamentary, and local government elections would be held simultaneously, and that's what happened in March this year, on the same day. That two, the presidential term of office was reduced from 6 to 5 years, and that one can serve as president only for a maximum of 2 terms. 3, that the Senate was expanded, the seats in the Senate were increased from 66 to 84, while the House was expanded from 150 to 210. All of them elected, no seats by appointment. 4, a joint sitting of the House and Senate would elect an acting president if the incumbent dies or is incapacitated or resigns until the next presidential election is held within 90 days. And 5, to establish a human rights commission. And I want to add here that still in the spirit of leveling the electoral playing field, the parties to the conflict agreed to amend some of the laws that the opposition had objections to. And these were three major laws. One, the Access to Information and Privacy Protection Act. Two, the Public Order and Security Act. And three, the Broadcasting Services Act. The opposition parties had said that these three pieces of legislation had limited democratic space. So they worked together, and these three pieces of legislation were amended and were unanimously adopted in Parliament by all the parties. Now, talks between the three parties continued under the facilitation of President Thabo Mbeki and resulted in an agreement on the rest of the modalities for the elections of the March 29 elections, which had the following results. In the House elections, the ruling ZANU-PF party lost its majority for the first time since independence, winning 97 seats to the MDC Tsvangirai's 99, and MDC Mutambara won 10 seats, and there was one seat won by an independent. In the Senate elections, ZANU-PF won 30 seats, and the MDC Tsvangirai 24, and MDC Mutambara 6 seats. In the presidential election, President Mugabe won 43.7% of the votes cast, and Morgan Tsvangirai of the MDC won 47.9% of the votes cast, and one independent candidate, Simba Makoni, won 8%. Now, the Constitution of Zimbabwe and the Electoral Act stipulate that a presidential candidate must acquire the requisite threshold vote of 50% plus one to be declared outright winner. In the presidential election held on the 29th of March 2008, none of the candidates attained the threshold requirement. The Constitution of Zimbabwe and also the Electoral Act further stipulate that in the absence of an outright winner in the first round of voting, there would be an electoral runoff. Both R.G. Mugabe and Morgan Tsvangirai agreed to go for the runoff. However, 5 days before the day of the runoff, Morgan Tsvangirai declared that he was withdrawing from the election, citing violence against his supporters by those of the ruling party. Now, this withdrawal was declared null and void by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission because the Electoral Act stipulates that a withdrawal shall not be effected less than 21 days to the day of voting. Hence, his name was on the ballot sheet, and people voted for him. Now, his party, the MDC, fully participated in the election for the 3 parliamentary seats, which was held on the same day. And MDC won 1, and ZANU-PF won 2. On July 1, 2008, the African Union Summit was held at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and issued a resolution in which they endorsed the SADC mediation in Zimbabwe through the designated mediator, President Thabo Mbeki, and encouraged all the parties to resume the process. Yet, the G8 meeting in Hokkaido, in Japan, under the instigation of Prime Minister Gordon Brown, proceeded to completely ignore the African Union position, agreeing instead to a package of further sanctions on the government of Zimbabwe. A draft resolution authored by the United Kingdom and the United States government was circulated at the United Nations Security Council. Among other things, it called for the declaration of Mr. Morgan Tsvangirai as the president of Zimbabwe, setting a dangerous precedent whereby the United Nations Security Council would henceforth be the supreme organ for declaring who the winners are and who the losers are in elections all over the world, ignoring the electoral laws and organs in the UN member states. Another draft resolution, which was vetoed by the Russian Federation and China, sought to impose a mandatory arms embargo and a travel ban on members of the Zimbabwe government, as well as freezing their assets. The African countries that are non-permanent members of the Security Council voted against this resolution, and the only African country to vote for this resolution, I will not mention his name. I think you want to do some homework here, do some research. The only African country to vote for this resolution or sanctions on Zimbabwe had his president in Washington, D.C. the following week to receive more than $400 million from the Millennium Challenge account. Now, although the United Nations has turned down the sanctions package and applauded the African Union's resolution on Zimbabwe, the European Union and the Bush administration proceeded unilaterally to impose further sanctions on Zimbabwe, even as negotiations had commenced in South Africa. The sanctions were imposed on the argument that there was electoral violence in Zimbabwe, even though the MDC was claiming that 80 of its supporters had perished in electoral violence, a small figure compared to the according to the Nigerian government, over 2,000 people who perished in Nigeria's electoral violence, which did not invoke sanctions from Western governments. There was indeed violence between the first round of voting in March and the runoff, but a few people in the West are aware of the origins of the violence. In an effort to prod the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission to hasten the announcement of electoral results, the MDC declared an indefinite national strike beginning the 15th of April 2008. And in an effort to enforce strike action, MDC youths put up roadblocks or blockades. They burned buses and houses, and they beat up people going to work in defiance of the call for strike action. This really started a spiral
of tit-for-tat violence that characterized the electoral period. Both ZANU-PF and MDC supporters were victims of the violence, but only violence by the ruling party is reported in the Western media. The violence has since petered out, and President Thabo Mbeki's mediation efforts have resulted in the signing on the 21st of July of a memorandum of understanding by the principals of the three political parties, that is President Mugabe, Morgan Tsvangirai, and Arthur Mutambara. The MOU is an agreement by the three parties setting out an agenda for more substantive talks under SADC mediation with the support of the African Union. The agenda covers political issues such as a new constitution and state organs and institutions, while the economic agenda covers issues such as economic recovery, and I think Madam Xu gave a list of the economic indicators showing that the Zimbabwean economy is in unprecedented turmoil. The agenda also includes the land question as well as the question of sanctions. Now, lastly, substantive negotiations commenced in South Africa on Wednesday, the 23rd of July, and are scheduled to last, they said, approximately 2 weeks, a short period which appears to reflect the optimism of the parties involved. The talks are being held in utter secrecy, the parties having committed themselves not to negotiate through the media. The outcome of the negotiations, maybe whether a government of national unity, as some require, or a transitional government, as others are demanding, can only be a matter for speculation, but it will be a power-sharing arrangement and an inclusive government as stipulated by the MOU which was signed by the three parties. I think I will stop here and then take your questions. Thank you. Yes, please, at the back then.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for presenting a side of the story that we seldom hear in the United States, fleshing out the context, history, and sort of post-colonial stress sentiment many countries around the world have endured. What progress has been made on the status of the inflationary rate, the change in monetary policy and currency policy? I know it's been really a week or so. I guess what is anticipated?
The latest information that I have is that the governor of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, Gideon Gono, was issuing a statement today, Wednesday, and I think this statement would be out by tomorrow, and in which he will be outlining fiscal and monetary measures intended to tackle rampant inflation. So I think we just have to wait until tomorrow when we see the statement should be able to receive it tomorrow. Yes, please.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your very articulate and highly misinformed status of the Zimbabwe situation. Currently, the negotiations in Pretoria are symptomatic of the fact that Mugabe has been completely and utterly delegitimized by the AU and the SADC, because his one-man show on the 27th of December was a global sham that could never have passed for an election. That is why it was easy for MDC and SADC to drag Mugabe kicking and screaming to the negotiating table. Now the crisis of Zimbabwe is a result of an obsession of centralized authority and power and the hatred of opposition by Robert Mugabe, which dates back in 1980 when he started a conspiracy of annihilating and destroying ZAPU, which the ambassador cleverly excluded from his very elaborate explanation of the history of colonialism in Zimbabwe. So I just want to say that perhaps, Mr. Ambassador, can you explain the current status of decline of human rights and economic productivity, and why in a constitutional democracy almost 25,000 people have to die between 1980 and now, and almost 2 million citizens have been displaced into South Africa and England in the quest for survival. In a truly constitutional democracy, what has gone wrong in Zimbabwe? What is the paradox?
We have the first point here being the questioner referred to as a one-man show. I thought that in my presentation I did mention what the Zimbabwe Constitution says and what the electoral law of Zimbabwe says. When Morgan Tsvangirai pulled out of the election 5 days to the day of voting, his supporters, notably the British government and their allies, who had drafted who proceeded to draft the resolution to say he should be recognized as the president of Zimbabwe on the strength of the first round of election, in which he had more votes than the other 3 candidates. I mentioned that the Zimbabwe Elections Commission, Electoral Commission, or the ZEC, declared the withdrawal null and void because it had not been effected before 21 days to the day of election. It was made only 5 days to the day of election, so it was declared null and void. The government of Zimbabwe was arguing that we should be guided by what the Constitution and the electoral law says. We cannot stymie or abort the law. And this is why Robert Mugabe continued campaigning and went on to participate in the runoff, even though by that time he was just alone because the other party had withdrawn. But the runoff was in accordance with the rule of law, the electoral law, and the Constitution. Now, the questioner also referred to annihilating ZAPU. Now, this is a very contentious issue because during the liberation struggle, you had two liberation movements. You had ZAPU and you had ZANU, and both of them were waging the liberation struggle, and sometimes they would join hands, sometimes they would not. But after independence, having participated separately in the general election, there was still mutual suspicion and mistrust between the two parties. And what was revealed to all Zimbabweans were arms caches which had been which were in the had been put away by ZAPU, which was led by Joshua Nkomo, who, by the way, after the reconciliation took place and a unity agreement was signed between the two parties in 1987, he went on to become the vice president, and when he died, he was given, he was buried at the Heroes Acre, and he is referred to in Zimbabwe as the father of the country, Joshua Nkomo. But because of the arms caches, and not only that, because there was a revolt, this is a historical fact which can be verified by those who care. There was a revolt by one section of the army that ZAPU had, known as ZIPRA, and they had already marched on Conmara barracks, and they were going to Corn, and they were already in battle formation when the National Army was called and the Air Force was called to stifle the revolt. And when the revolt was quelled in a bloody battle, elements of the rebels roamed the countryside, killing white farmers particularly, and also terrorizing the rural population. They were known as dissidents in those years, and it is known that wherever you have guerrilla warfare, civilians are caught in the crossfire. Now, I've heard claims that up to 20,000 were killed, but this is denied by the government. And a recent book published by a lady known as Fei Chung, you want to check this one out, F-E-I, and then Chung, C-H-U-N-G, estimated that maybe a total of 6,000 civilians perished in that guerrilla warfare which was being waged by the dissidents. Now, concerning the economy, I think that Madam Shu gave a very comprehensive statistical or rather a summary of the very, very grim economic indicators in Zimbabwe, and I have already mentioned the fact of sanctions. One has to realize that the economy that Zimbabwe inherited was essentially an Anglo-American economy, and so very vulnerable to sanctions if the British and the Americans chose to impose, to close all the taps, and which they did, and this was reflected in the dearth of foreign exchange, general lack of credit, and diminishing productivity, which across the entire economy. And the issue of what has caused the economic downturn and how it can be changed can be the subject of a whole, the debate of a whole week in a seminar or in a conference or whatever. And so I don't think that I would be in a position myself to do justice to the topic in the minutes that are left to us. Yes, please. Now, in our diplomatic service, we have two streams. You have the political appointees. These are people outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Here you call it the State Department. One could be an executive of some company, or maybe a professor somewhere, and you are elected, you are appointed ambassador by the president. The second stream, that's where I belong. At the time of independence, there was no Ministry of Foreign Affairs because Rhodesia did not have any diplomatic relations. They stick to their proclaimed or averred mandate or agenda, but some of them have been seen to be having a political agenda behind what they declared when they registered, and so for those organizations that have been involved in food distribution in a genuine manner, such as, for example, the Red Cross and those who work with the WFP, the World Food Program, and so forth. They, as far as I know, they have nothing to fear. But there are those that have been caught distributing food and at the same time distributing opposition party regalia like T-shirts, and so forth, and campaigning for the opposition. They have something to fear. But the suspension of food distribution by some NGOs, not all NGOs, is a temporary measure. That's what the government said, and each organization will be assessed, and a determination will be made whether it is genuine or is it sticking to its declared mandate when it was registered. Yes, please. Yes, please.
What is your understanding of the role of the military?
I think this is an area where there has been a lot of speculation, because, but one thing that I know for sure was that there was a time when the heads of the service organizations, the Air Force, the Army, the police, and the prisons,
they issued a statement to say, because they regard Morgan Tsvangirai as, they say, he is a puppet of the British, and why is he being funded by the British? Why is he being funded by the Americans? That they will not salute a British puppet. That statement, I saw it myself. They said they would refuse to salute him. But whether the army took an active role in the during this electoral process to force Mugabe and his party into negotiations or not to go into negotiations, I really don't know. That would be a matter for speculation, I think. The lady at the yes, please.
Just this morning, BBC News aired part of an interview of Morgan Tsvangirai that was conducted by a U.S. reporter, and Tsvangirai was asked, why did you pull out of the race? He was asked this question numerous times.
Yes.
And on multiple occasions, he answered, the violence and bloodshed of my people isn't worth the goal of winning. It's not worth the victory. This seems to completely contradict the statement you made earlier, when you said that the reasons for the post-electoral violence were NBC blockades, fires, and mass killings. I was wondering if you could please clarify that.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to situate the origins of the violence. Where the MDC. Now, by the way, that brings me to the other issue about the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. That is the body that organizes Zimbabwe's elections, and that is the body which declares who the winner is. It's an independent body which in our parliament we have a committee known as the Standing Committee on the Parliamentary Committee on Standing Orders and Regulations. It's a bilateral committee which consists of members of the ruling party and members of the opposition party. And it is they who then nominate members of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, the ZEC. So 50% of the ZEC members are nominated by the opposition and 50% by the government. Now, to go back to your question, I was saying that when the ZEC had taken a week or so before they announced the elections results, because they said this is unprecedented, and true, it was unprecedented in Zimbabwe's history that on the same day, one day, you have elections for the president, elections for the Senate, elections for the House, and elections for the local government councils of Zimbabwe's cities. Well, originally this was meant because it was meant to be cost effective, but it really proved a mammoth task, and they couldn't come up with the results as early as they used to when elections were held separately. But the MDC thought that the ZEC was being manipulated by government, and they declared an indefinite national strike to begin on the 15th of April. And the next day they set up roadblocks to prevent people from going to work. They burnt 3 buses belonging to a company called Matambanadzo, and they also burnt houses, they beat up people, and so forth. Now, and I said in my presentation, this was that sparked this spiral of tit-for-tat violence. And I think that at the height of the violence, more opposition party members were killed than ruling party members. So I think that's what he was referring to, because when the violence became fully fledged, more opposition party members died than ruling party members. I think I will take the last question because they are waiting for me outside. Thank you. The lady at the back there. I thought she had raised oh no, okay. So, yes. Yes, please.
After the land was distributed, the large farms and the small farms, you had the land distribution after it became independent. I wondered now, what is the status now of the productivity of these agricultural farms?
Right. Productivity. Yes. Yeah, productivity has gone down. Yes. And because of this, wherever I go, I'm asked the question, you shouldn't have taken the land because you were not, you're not good farmers. We can see now that the land is producing less. And then I always give the explanation that we used to give during the political struggle. During the political struggle, Prime Minister Ian Smith and his Rhodesia Front party used to say, not in 1,000 years, because you people don't have the experience of running a modern state. And we used to say, but give us the right to vote so that we participate and we can have the experience. They would deny us that, you see. So when it came to the question of land, we're using the same the same example, saying, well, you cannot become a good farmer, a skilled farmer, modern commercial farmer, if you don't have land. Obviously, you must have land first, and then you will learn to be a farmer. You cannot, farmers are not born farmers. It's not something that you're born with or is peculiar to any race. It is an acquired skill. And when what has been happening is that a lot of these farmers were inexperienced, and so production has gone down. Production has gone down also because the government lacks the foreign exchange with which to purchase the crucial inputs like the equipment, farm equipment, the fertilizers, the seeds and so forth, which are all being imported. But this situation is being rectified. Some African farmers now have gone into farm seed production. They've also courses, farming courses have proliferated in the country, and farmers, a new crop of farmers is emerging, and we hope that production will be restored and may even surpass the
the original or the initial production. So I hope this answers your question. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, and